Hello everyone and welcome to a brand new video on the composition of blood. So this video, we're not even going to do an outline for this one. We're just going to jump right into breaking down the composition of blood and looking at its cell components and etc. What is blood actually composed of? So when we think about the composition of blood, we are going to, let me erase that and start over. It just had a delay about how soon that started. So let's say I have a vial of blood, and in this blood I'm going to have some components, and I will shade this in and then erase part of the shading just to make this a little bit more visible. And we'll talk about what each component is. And when I label some of the components, of course, I will erase portions of the shading and discuss it. So this would be a vial of blood that had been centrifuged down. I took whole blood, I put it in a vial, I centrifuge it down. The heavier stuff is at the bottom, the lighter stuff is at the top. Now, what we want to discuss is these major components. So let's talk that, let's talk this, and discuss what is in here. So right here we're going to have the red blood cells, or RBCs. Here we're going to have plasma. Now for the blue, I'm going to go ahead and erase in here, but it's I can't erase because of the way that it works with this. So I'm going to write off to the side here that this is the Buffy coat. And we'll talk about what Buffy coat is momentarily. Okay, so roughly what we're going to deal with is plasma is going to be roughly the big component. This is 55% of overall blood volume. Where red blood cells, that's going to be, and the Buffy coat combined, they're not going to be but 45%. And this is called formed elements. So we call this formed elements. Now we're going to talk about each of the formed elements, but I've got my formed elements that'll be at about 45%. So I've got plasma being 55%, red blood cells and the Buffy coat combined being formed elements being our remaining 45%. Now what we're going to do, we're actually going to start off with the composition of plasma. So if I were to take plasma and I wanted to study its composition, I'm going to see the first thing we're going to talk about are plasma proteins. And we're going to refer to the plasma proteins. Now, I am not going to go into every plasma protein in existence here, but these plasma proteins are about 7% of plasma's composition. Now, in that plasma proteins, I want to discuss that you're going to find albumin. Now, I'm not going to talk about every plasma protein, but albumin will, of that 7%, that plasma proteins comprise 7% of plasma, this is 60% of overall plasma proteins. Then, now, it contributes as like transport proteins. It comprises the, it produces the blood colloidal osmotic pressure, things like that. Okay, now our next one that I want to talk about, that's going to be our globulins. Now these globulins come in several types, but globulins are about 35% of overall plasma composition. Of plasma proteins, overall plasma protein composition. Let's be more accurate there. Okay, now globulins can be things like antibodies, called immunoglobulins. And I'm just going to call them antibodies here, sometimes called immunoglobulins or IGs, and then the all-important transport globulins. And that'll be another subtype we want to talk about is transport globulins. The transport globulins can, for example, just generally be a few of these. Now, I'm going to try to write them in here. One of these is called transthyretin. Transthyretin, which is important as a transport protein. And then let's talk transferrin for transporting iron. Transferrin. And let's talk, lastly, the apolipoproteins. Be the apolipoproteins. Apolipoproteins. And that'd be the last ones. Now, for other plasma proteins, there's a third important plasma protein that I want to talk about called fibrinogen. Now, fibrinogen, if you ever see gen at the end of something, you need to know it needs to be activated. Now, this is only about 4% of overall plasma proteins is fibrinogen. And then lastly, of the proteins, we have regulatory proteins, and these can be a lot of different things, regulatory proteins, and these are less than 1% of the plasma proteins. Less than 1% of plasma proteins are regulatory proteins. Now, another big component to plasma is going to be solutes. Now, solutes comprise about 1% of the volume of your plasma's materials. Now, the one thing I don't have the most abundant, of course, is water. That's the one thing I don't have here yet that I'm going to talk about, is that it is by far mostly water, and that, of course, is where most of that volume comes from. So, solutes are about 1%, and we'll talk about water being the most important component here is water. And what I like to talk about with that is that water by far the hugest composition. So I'll be discussing that. So solutes are about 1%, and this is a variety of things. This is electrolytes. This will be things like your nutrients. Now, I'm not going to go in and list every nutrient and everything. I've done that in my formal lectures. And then organic wastes. Now, what I want to discuss here is that all of these things are dissolved components found within plasma. Now, plasma, as I said, is by far going to be mostly water. And water being just about the last thing that we're going to talk about here is water. Water is about 92% of overall plasma volume. So that is our most abundant thing. Now let's move on to formed elements. Now we talk about formed elements being red blood cells here and our buffy coat. So let's start with our red blood cell composition here, and let's discuss red blood cells. RBCs are by far the most abundant here. They are about 99.99% of overall formed element composition. There are about 4.2 to about 6.3 million of these in 1 microliter of blood. Okay, so a very high amount of them. And 1 microliter of blood contains about 4.2 to 6.3 million. These are 99.99% of overall formed elements. This makes the rest of the formed elements here, let's kind of draw it like this. I meant to kind of stop right about, I'm going to go up and then like that. There we go. So let's talk about these formed elements. This is your Buffy coat. Now, what is the Buffy coat? The Buffy coat is made up of two components, and this is basically your white blood cells, your WBCs, and your platelets combined. And white blood cells and platelets combined, this is less than 0.1%. This is less than a percent, so it's about 0.1%, roughly about 0.1% to a little less than 0.1%. So let's say it's around about 0.1%. Less than a percent, definitely combined. Now, when we deal with white blood cells, WBCs, there are about 5,000 of these to about 10,000 of these in 1 microliter per microliter. Okay. Now, they come in different types. Let's talk about them. Never let monkeys eat bananas. Let's talk about never let monkeys eat bananas. We have what is called neutrophils, lymphocytes, monocytes, eosinophils, and basophils. Now, there is not a lot of room here to write. This can take up a lot of my screen. I tend to sometimes paint myself into corners when I do these videos like this. And so let's give myself just a little bit more room. And let me just clean this up a little bit. So about 5,000 to about 10,000 per microliter. Okay. Neutrophils, there are about 50 to 70% of these. Remember, never let monkeys eat bananas. That is the abundance. Then lymphocytes, they're about 20 to 30%. Monocytes, they're going to be about 2 to 8%. Eosinophils, they're about 1 to 4%. Basophils, they're going to be about 0.5 to 1% on the low number. Now, lastly is platelets, and that's our last component is platelets. Platelets are numerous. They're going to be more numerous than, of course, your white blood cells, but less numerous than red blood cells. They are about 50,000. 150,000. I meant to write. Sorry, I was thinking about something else there for a second. They are about 150,000. 150,000 to about 500,000 in 1 microliter. All right. So that's a lot of numbers to keep straight. So this really is the composition of blood overall, the general information that I would expect students to know. Now, if you're watching this from my anatomy and physiology class, remember you do not need to memorize the percentages of the white blood cells, just the relative order. That would be later on. Though I do have those in the notes, I tell you guys you're not responsible for that. So when we look at all these compositions and we look at all these things that go on to produce these numbers and counts, that is the composition of whole blood. Guys, thank you so much for watching my video. It's a short and sweet one for today, but one I've been wanting to do for a little while. So guys, thank you so much. I hope it's helpful to break these things down. Just draw it out, sketch it. I urge you to draw with me when I do these videos, so it helps you learn as well, because it is one of the best ways of getting the knowledge to you. Guys, thank you, and as always, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and let me know what you would like to see me do in future videos. But just as always, thank you so much for watching. Have a great day.